Welcome to the Winning Edge Investments Podcast. Winning Edge Investments provides industry-leading horse racing and sports betting tips, ratings and education, enabling you to invest intelligently and treat your betting like a business. Go to www.winningedgeinvestments.com to learn more about how you can start to supercharge your betting bank immediately. Treat your betting like a business and invest intelligently with Winning Edge Investments.
Anthony, Manton, thanks so much for joining me. I've been following you for years, so it's a pleasure to have you aboard here. I'll just give a brief introduction for those who don't know him, and I'm sure if you follow racing, you do. But mate, you've had an illustrious career: form analyst, TV presenter, freelance journalist, race caller, racing presenter, and also involved in bloodstock as well. It's fair to say you are heavy in the racing, mate. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, welcome, Bryce. Great to chat with you. You're right. I have covered quite a few bases in my career. Actually, you missed one. I was a former bookie before I got into the media as well. So I've pretty much covered every aspect of racing, bar training the horses or riding them.
I think there's that's the only thing left. Do you reckon you'll ever get to training at one point?
No, I wouldn't have thought so. I do enjoy being around the horses and being in that environment, but mate, I'm flat out letting them underwater. So no, I wouldn't have thought so.
Yeah, look, it's you've dabbled in plenty of things, and at the moment, what you're mainly doing is race calling, and you've just been presenting Sky Racing HQ as well, which you did a brilliant job at. I'll just defer firstly, what did get you into racing, Anthony? What was the spark that you really liked?
Well, I grew up in the country, and my grandfather and my uncle were punters, and they had a couple of horses as owners. But it was really my grandfather's influence that encouraged me to take an interest in horse racing. So I remember when I was probably 8 or 10, being picked up and taken to the races in the region that I was growing up in, and my brother and sister were invited, but they weren't as keen as I was early on. So I remember my grandparents picking me up and taking me to the races when I was about 8 at a little track called Tumbarumba, which is up in the snowy mountains of New South Wales. And my uncle happened to have a horse running at that time. The horse's name was Proud Reserve. As it happened, my first day at the races, Proud Reserve won. And I must have had a small bet. And then the next week or the next 2 weeks after, back in those days, the tracks in that region would take it in turns to run every week or every fortnight. So the next fortnight, I think it was a Saturday, we went to a little track called Tumut, and Proud Reserve fronted up again, and Proud Reserve won again. And then 2 weeks later, we went to Gundagai, and same thing, Proud Reserve won again. So in a 6-week period, this horse called Proud Reserve won 3 races in successive Saturdays. And it was probably like that I was hooked after that. I just loved it. And you know, I would come home from a day at the races as an 8 or 10-year-old and you know, and collect the race books. My grandfather would give me the race books, and he was very he would write down the results and the times and his bets, and I would come home after a day at the races or the Sunday after the Saturday races, and I'd sit on the veranda of my grandparents' house and just recite every race again as if I was the race caller, and that was how I kind of how I started and developed my passion for racing.
You worked out that it's better than pocket money, being able to go to the races and come home with a collect.
I can't remember if I must have had a bet. I can't really remember. I must have had a bet. I remember being probably 13 or 14 years old, a couple of years after that initial sort of, you know, period where I started to really take it more seriously. And I remember as a 13, 14-year-old putting my bets on for my grandfather. He would, you know, give me his $10 or $20 or whatever, and he'd say, go see. There was a local bookie that he used to bet with, a gentleman called Bruce McCarthy, who's still down in Gundagai, and I still see Bruce to this day. And he'd say, go have this with Brucey. And I was, you know, I was 13 or 14 years old. You're not allowed to bet, but I'd rock up and Bruce would take my money and I'd say it was for my pop. So I must have been given a few dollars each way, as well as my grandfather's money to put on at that time. But I wasn't so much the punt that grabbed me. It wasn't so much the gambling side of it that grabbed me. I don't know. I just loved the whole atmosphere about it, and the race callers in particular, and just being there and the people. Yeah, it wasn't so much the punt.
And you mentioned you were calling races at a young age. When you were doing that, was it a bit of fun, or were you thinking in your head, this is what I want to do later down the track as a career?
I always knew I wanted to do it, but I always felt it was very unattainable as well, because other than my grandfather and my uncle's involvement in racing, I didn't really like. And I moved away from where I grew up in high school. So I finished high school in Sydney, and as a teenager had other interests and whatever, and horse racing was kind of in the back of my mind as a teenager, and still something that I took an interest in and I enjoyed. But I was living in Sydney. I was away from that rural country environment where I'd grown up as a kid, and yes, I wanted to get. I had this idea that I'd love to do race calling, but I actually thought it was too unattainable. I didn't know how to start. I didn't know. I didn't think it was possible. So I finished school and I just got a regular job. But then it wasn't until a few years after school where I started in the racing industry, just at the absolute ground level. And just like anything, I think in any industry, you just work your way up. And I saw little opportunities here and there to sort of progress in my career, and eventually took up race calling. But I was actually quite a late starter doing it for the real thing. I mean, most guys start in their teens doing the real thing. I used to call off the TV and bits and pieces as a kid, and I'd recite races on my grandparents' veranda. But actually getting to the track and trying the real thing, I was 24. So I was actually quite a late starter to do the real thing.
Yeah, well, look, you've come a long way. It's a very impressive career, and it's interesting to hear you say that just from a young age, doing the race calling. When I was younger, I've always had the dream of making music and sort of visualize myself practicing with the DJing. So it's the same kind of thing when you do it at a young age and think, is a music career attainable as well when there's a market, and especially with race calling, it's not a huge market. You've only got X amount of races, X amount of callers. So yeah. I can see what you were saying with thinking this, how do I go about this? So working your way up's a really good, I guess, piece of advice for anyone that's thinking about it as well, who may be listening.
Yeah, and I think if you are interested in doing it, or you've got an interest in race calling, you really have to try the real thing. And I think the best advice I can give anyone that's curious is get yourself to a track and just meet local race caller wherever you live. Go to the race course, introduce yourself to the local race caller, meet people, and doors will open, but you have to put yourself in a position where they can open. So my first day at the races where I actually tried the real thing, I contacted the ATC and I asked if there was a spare box, a broadcast box to use in the old Randwick. This is before they redeveloped Randwick. And as luck would have it, there happened to be a spare box in the very top of the grandstand. There was 3 boxes in the broadcast facility. And as pure luck would have it, back in those days, there was 2 race callers in Sydney. Ian Craig was at the end of his career, and Mark Sheen was still calling at the time as well. So I was really fortunate to rock up to Randwick. I was already working in the industry, but I didn't know these guys from a bar of soap. And I was really fortunate to rock up to Randwick with a set of old binoculars and a laptop where I could record my races. And I set myself up and I called the races. And probably after 3 or 4 races, Mark Sheen came in the broadcast box and introduced himself. And he asked if he could listen to one of my races. And it was the first day I'd tried it. And I said, yeah, absolutely, Mr. Sheen, I'd love you to. Like, that's what I'm here for. Give me some feedback. And he listened to a race and he said, mate, that's terrific. How long have you done this? And I said, it's my first day. I've just been sitting at home calling off the TV. And he said, it's outstanding for your first day. You needed some fine tuning. You've got the wrong set of binoculars. You haven't got a binocular stand. I'll get you a binocular stand. Just keep turning up. And to his credit, he emailed me a few days later and he said, I've got an old binocular stand for you to use. I'll bring it to Randwick next week. which he did. And I got myself a better pair of binoculars and was able to clamp those binoculars to the stand that Mark had got me. And I just kept going back, like every Saturday. If I had a Saturday off, if I had a Wednesday off at Warwick Farm or Canterbury, I just kept going back, just calling races to myself, just honing my skills until an opportunity came along. So that would be my advice to anyone that's interested in race calling or curious. Get yourself to the track and see if you can do it. And if you can, just keep honing your skills. Just keep going week after week, and eventually the doors will open.
Yeah, really love that advice. Just in the deep end somewhat, and that's a great story. It's thanks for the insight there. Well, your calling is really precise. It is easy to follow, and when I listen to it, it's something that I think I can see without visually watching it, which is, I assume, what you want to achieve. But I'm just wondering, as a race caller, what do you think is most important to you? Is it calling the race correctly? Is it having a bit of entertainment? Is it being clear with your speech? What do you think is the factor that you want to get across the most when you're calling a race?
Well, first of all, one thing the main emphasis I put on my calling, and some of your audience may have picked it up or may not have. The first thing that I will do is I always call the favourite first. I come from a bookmaking background. I come from a punting background, and that's where the bulk of the money is. So the first horse I ever call when the gates open is the favourite, because people want to know, where did it jump? It'll either jump midfield or it'll jump in front, or it might miss the start or whatever. So first and foremost, that's the first horse I call, and then after that, it's. I mean, you just want to be accurate. You want to get them in an accurate order at least once. For a 1,000-meter race, you want to get through the whole field before they get to the home turn. 1,200-meter race, you can, if we're talking a field of 14 or 16, you can get through them 1.5 times. In a 1,400-meter race, you can pretty much get through them twice before they get to the home turn. So I'm mindful of that. And then it's just a matter of being accurate. And like you said, if someone's listening on radio, being able to identify where their horse is without being able to see the pictures. So if I'm big on leaders back, 3 pairs back the inside. I'm big on horses that are 3 wide without cover, or horses that are 3 wide with something to follow, so they can get a blend into the race, that sort of thing. So just trying to paint a picture for the listener that's not watching where their horse is, and then after that, it's just trying to be accurate and adding a little bit of entertainment if you can, if the opportunity's there. Sometimes it's not, but if the opportunity's there to have a little to add a little bit of entertainment or excitement to the race call, I'll do that. But generally speaking, just being accurate. Just being accurate. But also, I try to put a bit into like if it's a country championship race or a country cups or whatever, I do try to put a bit extra into them, because for me, as a regional, mainly a regional provincial race caller, they're the bigger races that I call. So I try to put a little bit extra into them as well.
Yeah, you just answered my next question, which was what are races that are important to you? I do notice quite a bit on social media after you call them. There've been some fantastic ones, front page enormous recently. It was a heck of a run, and they're races that love to watch. I remember it was Edit about 1.5 years ago. I was ultra keen on, just needed to get it to the outside, and I know that they were quite keen on its chances as well. So I was, it's those races are cracking. I love the country ones as well. It throws up some interesting fields. The form lines are everywhere, so it's always intriguing. Do you have any goals coming? Oh, sorry, you go.
Oh, I think for me, like having grown up in the country, I think back to my childhood and where I grew up and where I first went to the races, and I'm really passionate about country racing. So for me, those country cups, those country championship races, they're really special for me. I love to put a bit extra into them, they're sort of the highlight of my year, I guess. Like Wagga Carnivals, Canberra Cup Carnival, Black Opals. Down the south coast, they've got Maruya and Sapphire Coast and those sort of places. So I put a fair bit extra into those country cups. They're my grand finals.
Love it. Do you have any goals coming up with calling? Any particular races you'd love to cover in the future?
Look, we'd all love to call Golden Slippers and Melbourne Cups and Doncasters. Look, the reality is, with the way the structure is these days, like Darren Flindell's a brilliant caller, and he's our senior caller at Sky, and he's got that job for as long as he wants. So the reality is, I probably won't get the opportunity. And even a guy like Matt Hill in Melbourne, Matt's a couple of years older than me. I'm 40 this year. I think Matt's my age, maybe a few years older. So he's got that job for as long as he wants, and he is the absolute goat of race calling. So we'd all love to call Melbourne Cups, Golden Slippers, Doncasters, Cox Plates, but the reality is it's probably not going to happen. Perhaps in another era, it might have, because back in 30 or 40 years ago, that there was multiple TV or radio channels, so they'd have three, sometimes four guys calling the same race. But these days, you go to Randwick or Flemington on a Saturday, and there's one caller. That's it. There's one caller. So opportunities are far less than what there were back in the day. So realistically, probably not going to get the chance in my position to go any higher than where I've sort of probably already got to.
And in terms of race callers, you mentioned Matt Hill, the GOAT. Is he the one you reckon you guess is one of your favourite callers in Australia?
Yeah, nowadays, absolutely. I just respect him so much. He just never makes a mistake. He just never makes a mistake, and I just know how hard that is to do. Like, quite often, I can go to the races, and there'll be 8 or 10 races, and you might call 7 or 8 of them and pretty well, and there'll be a couple of dodgy ones where you might stumble over your words or get a photo wrong or whatever. Matt just never makes a mistake. He's just accurate every single time. Very, very rarely would you see Matt make a mistake. And I think that's the difference between him and the rest of us, that there's just so few mistakes in his calls, whereas the rest of us can have a dodgy one from time to time or stumble over our words or whatever. He never does that, ever. But growing up, I probably admired guys like Darren McCauley in Perth. Like, he was a guy that I thought was a brilliant race caller. And over in New Zealand, there was a guy called, he still calls to this day, Tony Lee. I think he calls the bottom of the North Island. And I just, he used to get this growl in his voice when in a close finish, and I really admired him. And it was funny because I spent some time calling overseas about 10 years ago. I was based in Malaysia for a few years, and when I left that role, Tony actually took my position for, 12 or 18 months. So it's funny how things work out. But those two guys in particular. But nowadays, I respect them all because I know how hard it is. But Matt's he just never makes a mistake. He's just the best.
Yeah, he's extremely good at what he does. It's one thing to watch a race on mute or not have any volume, and it's just such an underrated art, race calling. There's a lot that goes through the head when you're doing it. And one thing I've wondered is, past the line, what's the process when the horses go? Because I know it'd be always a focus on watching the winner, but when you've got a clump of 15 of them so close together, you manage to accurately call almost every single time them through the line in the right order. How does that just get better over time? How are you watching them as they cross? Because it's something that's
it depends. Yeah, it depends. It depends what track I'm at. It also depends on if it's a close finish and you have to identify the first, second, and third. What I've found I've got myself into the habit of doing often in the broadcast box. There's a Sky Racing TV on, and that's generally on a delay of about 3 to 4 seconds. So I can call the race live with the winner, and I can turn to my left or my right, and I can see the TV, and I can actually get the place getters. Literally, it's perfect timing because it's on delay. You can get the place getters, and then you can call off the TV, and then the last few you might just have to go back to the binoculars and try and get them in some sort of order. So if you've got that TV in the broadcast box, I'm using that more regularly these days, because you can literally see where the horses are and you just spit them out, and it's pretty much an accurate order. and that, yeah, it just depends. If a horse wins by a big space, and they're all strung out, it's pretty easy. You can just call A, B, C, D, and then across the line. But if there's a bunch finish and it's close and you've got to identify first, second, third, the TV is a really useful tool for that. Yeah,
absolutely. Do you have a particular race you could go back to that you just think's one of the best calls you've made recently, maybe in one of the country cups, or is there anything you're really happy with?
I think the call that I got the most feedback from was would have been, what year are we in? Let me just Google the horse and I'll find out what year it was. It was the country championships at Wagga. Would have been 2, perhaps 3 years ago. Horse called Another One, won the race.
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah,
and there was about 4 of them. I'll send you the link. There was about 4 of them lined across the track. And I happened to get them in the right order. It was just, and he never looked like winning, this horse. Never ever looked like winning until the last 50, 20 meters or so. And all of a sudden he sort of launched at them late and he won. So that was probably the race that I got the most feedback from. And that would have been 2021. So it was 2 years ago, 2021 country championship race at Wagga. Which Another One won, and there was about 4 of them stretched across the track. So that's probably one that comes to mind. This year's Black Opal was won by a horse called Autumn Ballet, and she was actually the first horse to ever win the race on debut. And I tweeted something out the morning of to some Black Opal historians to see if there was a horse that had ever won the race on debut, and there hadn't. So I had that little piece of information, and I'd scripted something, and she was able to win. So that was cool that all went to sort of plan. Those two races probably come to mind off the top of my head.
And when you mentioned scripted, do you sometimes pick up things you'd be happy to say and have it in the back of your head when if something's to win, for example, just as you have with Autumn Ballet?
Yeah, I do. I like to have a few things, and it might only be a maiden at Wagga or somewhere. I often quite like to just be a bit creative and play with the horses' names and come up with something. Come up with something that sort of that you can refer to the name or whatever. And the horse has got to win, obviously, but I like to. I don't know. It's fun. It makes the day go. Sometimes, middle of winter, you can be calling a race meeting and you're just blurting out names. But quite often, I like to look at the form guide and think, if this happens to loom up, I could say this or I could say that. And so I do like to script things from time to time, and they've got to win though.
Yeah. Script something and it runs last, and you're like, well, that's not going to be used today.
another one that comes to mind was, and the same horse, another one when he won the country championship final a couple of would have been last year, 2022, and he'd run second the year before, and he'd come back for the country championship final at Randwick, and I was fortunate enough to call that race, and it was day one of the championships, and I had a line scripted that Another One second last year, won better this year, Another One. So and he happened to win, so that was I was pretty chuffed with that. Yeah.
And I think people at home love it. If you can pick up on something clever, a smart line or two, I think people really enjoy it. It makes it more entertaining as well. So
Darren Flindell's the best at it. He
loves it.
He stays up late at night and comes up with certain things, but he's the absolute best at it. But I like to do it from time to time as well.
I was going to ask you that. Do you think Darren's laying in bed at night and thinks, "Yep, that'll do it. That'll do it," because he comes up with a lot of good one-liners.
Yeah, I've asked him on air that he swears he hasn't, but I suspect he does.
And we'll just go in terms of form, because I've followed your tipping for a long time now, and you know how to find them. Anyone that follows Sky Racing knows your best bets are phenomenally accurate often. And so with form, what do you think is most important? Because there's just such a massive table of things that you got to consider. And I guess the more you get into racing, you understand how many different factors there are with form. You can keep learning them years on, little things up to big things. But if you could nail it down to one thing when you're doing form, what do you think means the most to you?
That's a good question. The one thing that, and I was asked this question very early on in my career, or that same question was posed to a group of us, and a pro punter or someone that was highly respected at the time said, if there's one piece of information in a form guide that's the most important, what is it? And some people said trainer, some people said jockey, some people said barrier, some people said track conditions, weight, all sorts of things. Everyone skirted around the one piece of information that was the most important, and the most important is SP. So if you pick up a form guide and you're looking at a Dubbo maiden, for example, and you know nothing about any of these horses, you don't know one horse from the other. If you look at every horse in that race and look at their SP of their previous race, that's going to be the most important guide for that particular race. If you know nothing else, and that's all you wanted to go off, that would be the one piece of information I would give to your listeners, would be just to look at that, the SP of that particular horse, because at the end of the day, the market that's the most accurate assessment of that horse's chances, regardless of what Joe Blow or Joe Smith, the form analyst, thinks. The market and the overall volume of money at the end, when that race jumps, what that horse SPs is the single most important piece of information in a form guide. So if you know nothing else, use that as your guide to have a bet at its next run. That's in a nutshell, if it's one piece of information. But I think for me, I was very fortunate when my second job in racing, I worked for a corporate bookmaker at the time. This is early 2000s, and there was a team of analysts, and I was very green. I thought I knew a lot, but I actually didn't know too much. But there was a team of form analysts that were more senior than I am. I was probably, I was mid-20s, and there was a team of senior form analysts that were a lot more senior than I. And I was able to learn some really important form principles that have stood the test of time for 20 years now, that I still use to this day in terms of reading a race. So things like acceleration and being able to identify acceleration from a particular horse, horses that can take control in a race, horses that are affected by pace, horses that are affected by bias, breaking down sectional times. There's a whole list of principles that we used to do our own post-race analysis at the time, and I've just not forgot those principles over the years, and I still use them every day when I'm doing my form, and they've come in handy. The other thing that I really focus on, in terms of you mentioned my best bets, and I've had a pretty good run over the years with being able to identify the best bets from any particular meeting. They're generally in maidens. Very, very rarely would I step outside and declare something a best bet that's not in a maiden, because I find that you can certainly identify the winners a lot easier in a maiden, because there's so many horses that can't break their maiden. Just you only got to look at the statistics. There's X amount of horses that get to the races each year, and only a certain percentage of them win their maiden. So I just use that rule of thumb to my advantage. And if there's a field of 14 in a maiden, and there's only 2 or 3 that can win it, well, the rest of them are taking up too much percentage in the market. So I'll just focus on the ones that I believe can win, focus on the ones that I think can take up a position, that are drawn well. I generally speaking only bet in short course maidens as well, 1,000 to 1,200 meters. And as I said, I just focus on those that can take up a position, and that can show those things like acceleration, control, and then just try and nut out the ones that can't. And it all comes down to, as I said, that if there's a field of 14 and only 2 or 3 of them can win, well, the rest of them are taking up too much percentage. So there's got to be an opportunity to back the 2 or 3 that can win.
Yeah, that's really good insight. There's a couple points there that, that's the SP ones. particularly interesting. I sort of blurred that out until this year, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because the more I've looked and noticed exactly what you said with SP, you can see something start $2 and finish 4 or 5 lengths away, and its next start it just comes out and blouses them in its next run. And as you said, money speaks volume. This game is a lot of it does revolve around money, and it does speak depth of a horse's chances prior to its run. So that's a really good call you made there. I totally agree. And I turned a blind eye to it until this year. I started to learn a bit more. Okay, this is interesting. This is really interesting. Where the next run they come out with a short SP prior, and as you said, there's just improved length sometimes. Sometimes a horse is off, or cardiac arrhythmias. Arrhythmia is one I've started to pick up on when the bookies tend to put a line through horses sometimes when they've got a breathing issue, and they'll come out next run and improve a lot. But for anyone listening, there's a key principle stand the test of time. And
I think it's another piece. It's another piece of the puzzle. Like it's a big puzzle, and there's so many pieces, but it's just one piece of the puzzle. And like I said, if you're a newbie, if you're a Saturday punter, and you just want to look at one piece of information and not have to do your form and look through videos and all this sort of stuff, if you can look at a race and think, well, what had the shortest SP at their most recent run, and I'll run with that. You'll be on the right track, I think.
And you mentioned as well with only touching maidens. Do you think find something you're good at and hone in on it in terms of punters out there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not to say I don't bet outside maidens, but I've really found my niche, and it's in the region that I cover, which is typically in the southern parts of the state, Canberra, Wagga, Maruya, Goulburn, that region, Kembla Grange, and I've taken a bit more of an interest recently, and I'm sort of betting a bit more recently at sort of Newcastle and Hawkesbury, and find myself, just because I'm watching a lot more trials in the city, just through my role at Sky, so I'm branching out a little bit more. But you just can't do it all. Like I think a lot of guys want to be across the form in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and know it all. You just can't. It's just impossible. So find your area and just stick to it. Just find your pool of horses and just stick to it, and you'll be surprised how well you might go. Find your area, stick to your principles, and keep records, and you might surprise yourself how well you go.
In terms of jockeys, who do you think at the moment's really rising up the ranks? Are there any young fellas or females you think are really starring at the moment?
I interviewed a guy on Sky a couple of weeks ago that's been riding a lot on the provincial and country circuit, that's flying under the radar. Hebelin van der Hoven. I think he was originally came out from South Africa and was riding for Björn Baker, and he was on a restricted visa. He could only ride for Björn, so it meant that his opportunities were really limited. But he's now freelancing, and I think if you look at his stats on the provincial and country circuit, he's riding as well as anyone at the moment. Like, I'm talking Aaron Bullock-like stats in the country. So heavy, they call him heavy. He's riding really well. Bullock's just a freak in the country. He's doing amazingly well, but the market's sort of caught on to him. So I think a lot of his horses are starting unders because he's just so much better than the competition. Certainly the country meetings. So those two guys, I've taken particular interest in Tyler Schiller's career because, like, Tyler came through down at Wagga when he was apprenticed at Jerilderie as a 4 kilo claiming apprentice, and I was calling the races down there, and just a little kid that claimed 4, and he used to, he was just it's like slaying them down at Wagga, and to see his progression in a short period of time. I mean, we're only talking. It was peak COVID, and he was claiming 4. So what's that? 3-4 years ago, he was claiming 4 at Wagga, and now he's one of the leading riders, not only in Sydney, but one of the leading riders in the country. So to see how far Tyler's come in a short period of time, I'm just super proud of him. He's someone I'd consider a friend, and I'm really paid particular interest to his career, and all the apprentices actually, like, they're all good kids, like Reece Jones, Dylan Gibbons. I remember Dylan coming to the races. I know his father, Andrew, pretty well, and Dylan had come to the races with his father, and he was 14, 15-year-old kid, and now he's one of the leading apprentices. And they're all just really good kids. There's no rubbish in them. Reese is another one, like Reese Jones. I'd see Reese at the races and he'd refer to me as Mr. Manton, and I'd just be like, Reese, please call me Anthony. Like, I'm not that old. So they're all just good kids, and doing really well. So I'm really pleased to see all those kids do well, because I've been going to the races and crossing paths with them for years.
Yeah, it would be really interesting seeing the progression, as you mentioned with Tyler Schiller. It was around COVID time. He'd just begun, and him and the other two fellas you just touched on, Dylan Gibbons and Reece Jones, I kind of expected those three names when I said guns on the rise, because you just kept seeing them win on the and racking up the winners. And I was a huge Dylan Gibbons follower. I'll be talking to him tomorrow, and he just kept winning. And every time I'd tell my mates, look, I think this guy's going to be the next J-Mac when he's older. And now he's come to the city, and he's just had 4 on the weekend, and all of them from wide barriers. And he's got him and Tyler Schiller and all Reece Jones, both young guys that make it look quite simple, and they're just relaxed operators when they ride. You can look at the barriers Dylan had on the weekend, and it was 14, 9, 11, and something else, and managed to put them all in good spots, which is what J-Mac tends to do. And as you mentioned, Aaron Bullock, who's unbelievable. As you said, his stats are insane, and just knows how to ride a winner. You did touch on the unders there with interesting comment you made with Bullock and the prices. Do you think they're catching on a lot, and a lot of his chances are now just too short?
They tend to be. I noticed one today. It ended up winning, but they tend to be a bit shorter, just purely for the fact that he's riding them. And I have noticed it. But I mean, he's so good. More often than not, they'll probably win, but you've just got to account for that in your assessment when you're doing your markets. If you've got an idea in your mind of what price a horse should perhaps be, just add in the Bullock factor, and you'll have to make it a bit shorter, because remember when I was learning form analysis back in the day, you'd have your database, and you could add a length for a good map position, or you could take a length off for a poor map position. Well, I think if anyone's got their own database, or and they're creating their own betting markets, well, when it comes to a particular horse and Aaron Bullock's riding it, you'd probably hit an extra length or two, and that's going to make your price go from, if you had it $2.50, it's now $1.80. You know what I mean?
Tricky question, but is there a particular ride you can remember from all your years of calling you think is the best you've ever seen?
Nah, too hard, mate. I remember Tyler winning. Tyler was killing them at Wagga, and I remember giving him a few raps back in the day, and great ride from time to time. But nah, not really. I couldn't think of one in particular.
I think when Alicia Collett split the gap on Charlante, I'd watched its trials, and I was pretty happy when you were calling that home. As soon as that got clear,
was that Nara one day?
I think it was. Yeah, it trialled like it was ready to win by 20 lengths, and as soon as it got the gap, he just said, "And here's Charlante," and I was pretty happy with that call. That was an impressive win.
Yeah, that was a good. She did. I think she won again next start at Wyong maybe. I don't know. She sort of dropped off a little bit, that horse. I haven't seen her recently. So.
Yeah, won its next start, and then came to town and had a couple of runs. Didn't handle Vic, but just missed in a BM72 sort of a couple months ago. Okay. Haven't seen it since, but I had pretty keen eyes on that early doors.
There's one you should search it as well. Speaking of Alicia, she rode one for Jenny Williams' horse called Jalmari earlier this year at Maruya.
I remember the ride. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, like just pierced the apple or pierced the needle through them, and got there in the last stride. Don't think the horse has won since.
I do remember it. I think I had the live betting below, just watching the prices, and Jal Murray just blew out the roof, because they had no hope from there.
And she found a way. It was quite remarkable, and she showed so much nerve to come up underneath them all. It was freakish.
It kind of reminded me of the Jamie Carr ride on Vega 1. That was something as well, when she split her, and that was good. Well, we've only got a couple minutes left, but we'll just touch on the bloodstock as well. Can you just briefly run us through, because I know you're director and do some work with Mitchell Beer. Can you just give us a rundown there?
Yeah, so I'd often, I'd always raced horses on my own. Ever since I could, I'd take a share in a racehorse, and I sort of the last, I don't know, 6 or 8 years had started to be a bit more active and buying a lot of tried horses on English Digital, and I'd get a group of people together and race them, and then we'd race them for a period of time, and then move the horses on. And I probably did that for, I don't know, six or 8 years, and would manage the syndicates, and it was a bit of work to do that. And then I happened to meet my business partner, Mitch Lloyd, who was doing very similar. He was a big supporter of the tried horse auctions, and was buying horses and sending them out west and doing something very similar. So we had a common interest, and we both just agreed that we've been doing this for free for a number of years. Why don't we just kind of put our heads together and create a business and get our syndicators license, which we did. So we created Patriot Bloodstock, and we applied for our syndicators license, and we started out buying a couple of very cheap horses. I think the first horse we bought was about $4,000. She never won a race, but she was placed a couple of times, and then we moved her on. But I think the second horse we bought was a horse called Will to Excel for $8,000, and we won a couple of staying races with him, and he actually happened to win a lead up to the Jericho. So we paid $8,000 for this horse, and within 4 or 5 months we were running in a Jericho at Warrnambool for $400,000, and we went back and ran him the year after. He didn't win, but he ran really well. And then we just kind of snowballed from there. We ended up, I think, not long after that, we bought a horse called Well Insight. Myself and Mitch Beer found her online. She was sitting in a paddock in New Zealand, unraced, filly by Shalar. We bought her across. I think we paid $20,000, $30,000 for her landed, and she won her first 3 races, all at Albury, and she was Inglis eligible, and we ended up running in $1 million race in Flemington at her 4th start, and we were only 6 months into our business, not even. She didn't win, but that's beside the point. So we had a bit of luck early on with those 2 horses in particular, and then we just kept buying tried horses, and particularly with Mitch, we just had great success. Like pretty much every tried horse we bought in that first 12 months won at least once or twice. We didn't spend a lot of money for them. I think the most expensive horse we bought was $25,000 maybe for Mitch. That's about it. I think the most expensive horse we've bought to date is maybe $35,000. We haven't spent a lot of money on them. The cheapest horse we've bought is 4. That's a horse called Morgenstern that ended up winning. I think he's won 5 races from 8 or 9 starts and about $100,000 in prize money. So we just started out. What started out as a hobby, we turned it into a business. We grew really quickly in a short period of time. We got to about 30 horses. This last 6 months has been horrific. If the horses haven't broken down, they've gone lame. If they haven't gone lame, they've died. It's just been one thing after another, and it is very much things just go in waves. Things just go in waves. But it's been a tough year this year. We've probably got about 20 horses on the books at the moment, so we're a bit down on numbers from where we were. But there's a few irons in the fire, and there's actually today we had most of our 2-year-olds that we bought this time last year just jumped out this morning at Wangaratta. We had 3 or 4 jump out down there, and we're hopeful that they'll make the grade and run well. I don't think anything's going to change our lives, but they'll win their races placed right down in the Albury region with Mitch in particular. And we've got horses with Brett Kavanagh now as well. So sort of just spreading our wings a little bit and really trying to take advantage of the country-only races, and particularly in the border regions. So Albury, for example, where Mitch Beer is, country-only races are pretty weak down there because the Victorians can't come, and you're too far from, you're a fair way away. You're sort of 5 hours from Sydney. So you're only sort of racing horses within that region, and the Victorians can't come, so they're pretty weak. And on the flip side, up in Ballina, where Brett Kavanagh's from, Same thing, Queenslanders can't come and you're a long way from Sydney. So they're a bit weaker. So we're just trying to take advantage of the country-only races. And if you look at the calendar, there's sort of 2 or 3 country-only races every race meeting in New South Wales. So there's a real opportunity there for horses you buy for cheap to get a win on the board. And I think with any horse we buy these days, if they win one race, they've done their job. The owners, they want to win. Anything after that is a bonus. But we don't hang on to them if they're not performing. We'll move them on. There's auctions every 2 weeks, so you can move them on pretty quickly. And there's always opportunities to get involved, and it's not expensive. For 5% in one of our horses, you can get in for $1,000, for example, for 5%.
And if anyone wants more information or want to get involved, whereabouts can they go for that?
If you're on Twitter, just shoot me a DM and I'll respond straight away. Or our website is patriotbloodstock.com.au. There's a link to the email address. And I'll be straight back to you as soon as I see it.
Well, Anthony, thanks so much for everything. That was massive insight on race calling, form, and the bloodstock as well. So really appreciate your time, and hope everyone enjoyed the listen and learned plenty from it.
Welcome. It's been a pleasure, Bryce. Thanks for having me.
Winning Edge Investments provides industry-leading horse racing and sports betting tips, ratings and education, enabling you to invest intelligently and treat your betting like a business. Go to www.winningedgeinvestments.com to learn more about how you can start to supercharge your betting bank immediately. Treat your betting like a business and invest intelligently with Winning Edge Investments.